The first thing that hit him wasn't the smell of smoke. It was the silence. The Montana plains were never truly quiet, not with the wind and the coyotes and the endless rustle of dry grass. But this was a dead silence, the kind that follows a scream. Deputy Sheriff Bill Thornton spurred his horse forward, his gut twisting into a knot tighter than a hangman's noose. He'd been a lawman for 15 years, and he knew that silence. It was the sound of something terrible having finished its work. The Henderson Ranch came into view, and it was worse than he imagined. Not just a home, but a blackened skeleton clawed against the bruised purple sky. The barn was a rib cage of charred timbers. The house, a skull with empty, staring windows. Smoke, thick and oily, still slithered from the ruins, carrying the god-awful stench of burned wood, burned wool, and something else. Something sweet and sick that made him want to gag. He swung off his horse, his boots crunching on scorched earth and shattered glass. This wasn't just a fire. This was an execution. He found Robert and Mary Henderson near what used to be the front porch. He didn't need to check for a pulse. He'd known Robert his whole life, shared drinks with him, stood by him at his wedding. He'd known Sweet Mary, with a smile that could melt a Montana winter. Now they were just shapes, things left behind by the flames. But as he stood there, hat in hand, a single, horrifying question burned through his grief. Where was their daughter? Where was 7-year-old Lucy? His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild drumbeat of panic. He knew who did this. Had to be the Blackwood gang. They'd been bleeding the territory dry, leaving a trail of bodies from here to the Badlands. And they were cruel. They enjoyed their work, especially when it came to the innocent. He began tearing through the wreckage, his voice raw as he screamed her name. Lucy! Lucy Henderson! Nothing. Only the mournful howl of the wind answered him, and it sounded like it was weeping. Every second that passed felt like a shovel of dirt on a tiny coffin. He was too late. He had to be too late. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he thought he'd imagined it. A whimper, like a trapped kitten. It came from behind the ruined house, from the old root cellar. The heavy wooden doors were blackened but hadn't burned through. One hung crooked on its hinge, a dark, gaping mouth leading into the earth. He scrambled over, his hands shaking as he pulled the door open. Lucy! Sweetheart, it's Deputy Thornton. Are you in there? A small voice, thin as a spider's thread, drifted up from the darkness. Deputy! Relief washed over him so powerfully his knees nearly buckled. He clambered down the stone steps into the cold, damp dark. She was huddled in the far corner, wrapped in a dusty, moth-eaten blanket, her small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. Her face was smudged with soot, her blue dress was torn, and her eyes were 100 years old. They'd seen the end of the world. It's all right, Lucy, he breathed, kneeling in front of her. It's all over now. I've got you. She didn't cry. She just stared at him with those ancient eyes. Then her small hand shot out and gripped the front of his coat with a strength that shocked him. She pulled him closer, her gaze locked onto his, and she whispered 5 words that would change his life forever. 5 words that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. She didn't say, the bad men hurt Mom and Papa. She didn't say, I'm scared. She looked him dead in the eye and whispered, they burned the wrong man. What did she mean? They burned the wrong man? The words made no sense. Bill stared into her eyes, searching for an answer, but all he saw was a deep, dark terror that went beyond a simple house fire. Lucy, what are you talking about? Who did this? But the spell was broken. She started to tremble again, her face crumpling as the tears finally came. The bad men, she sobbed, burying her face in his chest. Mama told me to hide. The bad men came. He held her tight, his mind racing, trying to piece together her cryptic words. The wrong man. Robert and Mary were both dead. What other man could she have meant? He carried her out of that dark cellar, up into the dying light. As he did, he saw them. Fresh horse tracks in the mud near the collapsed barn. At least 4 riders, heading northwest, towards the Badlands, the Blackwood gang's territory. It had to be them. So what did she mean? Was she just a terrified kid, confused by the horror she'd witnessed? Or had she seen something else? Something he was missing? He pushed the thought aside. For now, she needed to be safe. "I'm going to keep you safe, Lucy," he said, his voice a low growl of absolute certainty. "I promise you, no bad men will ever hurt you again." That promise felt different from any other he'd made. It wasn't just words. It was a vow sealed in ash and grief. He looked from Lucy's small, trembling form to the tracks disappearing into the wilderness. He would hunt down the men who did this. He would find Clayton Blackwood and his entire crew, and he would make them pay. He had to. For Robert and Mary, and for Lucy. He had to understand what she meant. They burned the wrong man. The words echoed in his skull, a riddle he knew he had to solve, even if it cost him his life. Because a horrible feeling was starting to crawl up his spine. The feeling that this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was something else entirely, and it was far from over. 3 days later, Bill stood in the tidy parlor of Margaret Whitfield, the town school teacher. She was a kind, silver-haired woman in her 50s, and she'd taken Lucy in without a second thought. But kindness wasn't enough to break through the wall the little girl had built round herself. "She hasn't spoken a word since you brought her here, Bill," Margaret said, her voice a worried whisper. Through the doorway, he could see Lucy sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a bowl of soup as if it were a million miles away. She was there, but she wasn't. Her spirit had fled back to that dark cellar. "The doctor says her mind is just protecting itself," Bill said, his jaw tight with frustration. "He says she'll talk when she's ready." He told Sheriff Morrison about Lucy's strange words, but the sheriff had waved them away. "She's a traumatized child, Bill. She doesn't know what she was saying. It was the Blackwoods. We all know it was." Morrison was already putting a posse together. They were riding out at dawn, and Bill was going with them. "You can't," Margaret pleaded, her gentle eyes full of fear. "That girl needs you. You're the only one she's connected with. Riding off on some vengeance quest won't help her." "It's the only thing that will," Bill shot back, his voice harder than he intended. He paced to the window, watching the children of Millbrook play in the street, safe and oblivious. "I made her a promise, Margaret. I told her I'd keep her safe. How can she be safe while the men who murdered her parents are still breathing? They could come back." He slammed his fist against the window frame, making the glass rattle. "They could come back for her." A tiny voice from the doorway made them both freeze. "Deputy Thornton?" It was Lucy. She stood there, looking like a little ghost in a borrowed dress. It was the first time she'd spoken since the fire. Bill knelt down, his heart aching. "Yes, sweetheart." Her eyes, those old, haunted eyes, were fixed on his. "Are you going to find the bad men?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He saw Margaret shake her head behind Lucy, begging him to lie, to soothe her, but he couldn't, not to this child. "Yes," he said softly, "I have to." Lucy's lower lip trembled, the first sign of the little girl lost inside the shell. "What if they hurt you, too? What if you don't come back?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. It was the one question he couldn't answer. But then she did something that chilled him to the bone. She stepped forward and took his hand. Her grip was cool and firm. "You have to come back," she said, her voice no longer a child's whisper. It was a command. "You have to, because you have to ask them." Bill frowned, confused. "Ask them what, Lucy?" She leaned in closer, and her next words were for him alone. A secret passed in the quiet parlor. "You have to ask them why they left the money." Bill's blood ran cold. He felt a jolt, like he touched a live wire. "Money? What money?" Lucy's eyes flickered toward the kitchen. "In the floor," she whispered. "Papa showed me. The money for the new bull. The bad men were shouting about it. But they didn't take it. They just burned everything." She squeezed his hand again. "Find out why, deputy. Find out why they left the money." He stared at her, his mind reeling. The Blackwood gang were thieves. They lived for money. Robbing ranches, hitting banks. It was all they did. If they'd gone to the Henderson place for money, they wouldn't have left it behind. Not even in a fire. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. They burned the wrong man. They left the money. These weren't the ramblings of a traumatized child. These were clues. And they pointed to something far more sinister than a simple robbery gone wrong. Sheriff Morrison was wrong. Everyone was wrong. This wasn't about the Blackwood gang's greed. This was about something personal, something targeted. And if the Blackwoods weren't there for the money, then what were they there for? Bill looked down at Lucy, at this tiny broken girl who had just handed him the key to a mystery he hadn't even known existed. The posse wasn't a mission for vengeance anymore. It was a hunt for the truth. And he had a terrifying feeling that the truth was buried deeper and was far more dangerous than anyone in Millbrook could possibly imagine. He was riding into the Badlands to hunt monsters, but he was starting to wonder if the real monster was someone they'd left behind. Dawn broke like a cracked egg, spilling gray light over the town of Millbrook. 6 men sat on horseback in front of the sheriff's office, their breath pluming in the cold air. Sheriff Dan Morrison, a man built like a bulldog, looked them over with eyes as hard as river stones. "The trail's 3 days cold," he grunted, "but Johnny Two Horses says he can follow it. The Blackwoods are holed up in Devil's Canyon. Once we go in, we come out through them, or we don't come out at all." Bill sat his horse a little apart from the others, his mind a whirlwind. Lucy's words had changed everything. Why did they leave the money? He'd spent the night tossing and turning, the question echoing in his head. He'd almost gone to Morrison with it, but something stopped him, a flicker of doubt. The way the sheriff had been so quick to dismiss Lucy's first words, his almost obsessive focus on the Blackwood gang, to the exclusion of all else. It felt wrong, too simple. Johnny Two Horses, the Lakota tracker, rode up beside them. His face, etched with the lines of 100 hard winters, was grim. "Found their trail," he said, his voice low and raspy, "but I found something else." He opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a small, ornate silver button, tarnished with soot. "Found this near the house. It's not from the Blackwoods. Their gear is rough, army surplus. This is fancy." Before Bill could get a closer look, Sheriff Morrison rode over, his expression annoyed. "A button? We're hunting murderers and you're collecting buttons, Johnny?" He snatched it from the tracker's hand and stuffed it in his pocket. "It's nothing. A stray piece of junk. Let's ride." The tracker's eyes met Bill's for a split second, and Bill saw it. The same doubt, the same unease. Johnny knew that button was important, and he knew the sheriff didn't want them to think so. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture Bill didn't want to see. A picture where the lines between lawman and criminal were starting to blur. This wasn't just a posse. This was a cover-up. But for what? As they were about to ride out, a horse galloped into town at a dead run, its rider shouting bloody murder. It was Pete Garrison, a rancher from the east. "Sheriff, the Blackwoods, they hit the Johnson place last night, burned it down, killed Henry and Martha." A collective curse went through the posse. Bill felt his stomach clench. But then Garrison delivered the final devastating blow. "They took their granddaughter, little Amy, only 9 years old." The news hit them like a physical punch. Another family, another child. "Which way?" Morrison demanded, his face a thundercloud. "North, towards Widow's Peak," Garrison gasped, his horse heaving. "And they left a message, carved on the barn door, said they were coming for Millbrook next, for revenge." The wind picked up, whistling down Main Street. Bill looked at the sheriff. Morrison's face was a mask of righteous fury. It was almost too perfect. Another raid, another atrocity, all pointing directly at the Blackwood gang. It was just the thing to erase any lingering questions, any stray doubts about silver buttons or abandoned money. It was the perfect distraction. "Change of plan," Morrison bellowed. "We're not going to Devil's Canyon. We'll cut them off at the pass near Widow's Peak. We'll save that little girl and end this right now." The other men roared their approval, their thirst for justice reignited. But Bill felt a cold dread settle in his bones. He looked at Johnny Two Horses, whose face was like carved stone. The tracker knew it too. This was a setup. The Blackwood gang was being herded, positioned like pieces on a chessboard. And so were they. They were riding into an ambush. He was sure of it. But he had no choice. A little girl's life was on the line. He had to go. He had to play his part in whatever twisted game this was. As they spurred their horses north, he felt like a pawn being moved by an unseen hand. He thought of Lucy's words. They burned the wrong man. Now he understood. The man who died in the fire, Robert Henderson, he wasn't the target. He was a message. And the real target, the real bad man, was someone much closer to home. Someone who wore a badge. And Bill was riding right into his trap. The ride to the pass was a tense, silent affair. Bill felt a dozen pairs of eyes on him, but the only ones that mattered were Johnny Two Horses. The tracker rode close, his expression unreadable, but every so often he'd glance at Bill, a silent question in his gaze. He knew this was wrong. The landscape grew harsher, the red rock formations clawing at the sky like the bones of dead giants. It was a land that kept its secrets, and Bill knew they were riding headlong into one of them. They reached the pass, a narrow corridor of stone that baked under the noon sun. Johnny dismounted, studying the ground. "They're close," he announced. "Maybe an hour behind us." Sheriff Morrison immediately started barking orders, positioning the men among the rocks above the pass. "Find a good spot, Bill," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We'll need your rifle." The gesture felt false, the smile on Morrison's face thin and brittle. He was positioning them for a slaughter. Bill found a perch behind a large boulder, his view covering the entire length of the pass. He loaded his rifle, the familiar weight a small comfort in the crushing uncertainty. He scanned the positions of the other posse members. Two were too exposed. Another was in a blind spot. These were rookie mistakes a veteran lawman like Morrison wouldn't make, unless he intended for those men to die. Bill shifted his position slightly, making sure he had a clear line of sight, not just on the pass below, but on Sheriff Morrison himself. The wait was agonizing. The sun beat down, the silence broken only by the buzz of flies and the pounding of Bill's own heart. He thought of Lucy. Why did they leave the money? He thought of the silver button, and he thought of Amy Johnson, the 9-year-old girl who was the bait in this deadly trap. He had made a promise to one little girl, and now another one was caught in the same nightmare. He wouldn't fail them both. Then came the sound of hoofbeats, distant at first, then echoing off the canyon walls. 4 riders appeared at the far end of the pass. Clayton Blackwood was in the lead, looking every bit the ruthless outlaw. But tied to his brother Jesse's saddle was a small, terrified figure with blonde pigtails. Amy Johnson. She was alive. A wave of cold, focused rage washed over Bill. Whatever game Morrison was playing, he would not let that child be the price. "Clayton Blackwood!" Morrison's voice boomed from the rocks. "You're surrounded. Release the child and surrender." Blackwood's laugh was like grinding stone. "Well, look what we have here, Sheriff. A welcoming party." His eyes scanned the rocks, cold and calculating. "Tell you what, you give us safe passage, and we'll think about letting the girl go. The only thing you're getting is a choice of rope or bullets," Morrison roared back. It was then that Bill saw it, a glint of sunlight off metal high up on the ridge behind them. It wasn't one of the posse. It was someone else, a 5th man, a sniper, positioned to fire down on the pass. But he wasn't aiming at the Blackwood gang. He was aiming at the posse, at them. The trap was about to be sprung. Morrison hadn't brought them here to ambush the gang. He'd brought them here to be executed, with the Blackwoods taking the blame. "Wrong answer," Blackwood snarled and nodded to his brother. Jesse Blackwood drew his pistol and pressed the muzzle to Amy's temple. The little girl whimpered. It was the signal. But a signal for whom? The sniper on the ridge? Or for Morrison? Bill had only a fraction of a second to act. He couldn't shout a warning. It would be too late. He had to make a choice. And in that instant, his promise to Lucy became crystal clear. He wasn't just there to keep her safe from the bad men in the pass. He was there to protect her from them all. He didn't aim at Jesse Blackwood. He didn't aim at Clayton. He swung his rifle to the right, found Sheriff Morrison in his sights, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was a thunderclap in the canyon. Morrison cried out, not in pain, but in shocked fury as the bullet splintered the rock inches from his head. It wasn't a killing shot. It was a message. "I know." Chaos erupted. The sniper on the ridge fired, but his shot went wide, confused by Bill's unexpected move. The Blackwood gang, realizing this was no simple ambush, opened fire on everything that moved, and the posse, caught between the outlaws below and a hidden sniper above, started firing in panic. It was a slaughterhouse. Bill slid down from his perch, firing on the move, not at the gang, but at the sniper's position, trying to keep his head down. He had to get to Amy. He scrambled across the open ground, bullets kicking up dust around him. He saw Clayton Blackwood wheel his horse around, his face a mask of confusion and rage. "What is this, lawman? You working with us now?" "I'm not working with anyone," Bill yelled back, "except that little girl." He reached Jesse's horse and cut Amy free with his knife, scooping her into his arms. He shoved her behind a cluster of boulders. "Stay down," he ordered. He turned back just in time to see Morrison, clutching a wounded arm, screaming at the sniper on the ridge. "Shoot him! Shoot them all! It's all gone wrong." So that was it. Morrison had made a deal with Blackwood, or some other party, to wipe out the posse and pin it on the gang. But why? Then he saw Johnny Two Horses. The tracker was moving like a ghost through the chaos, his own rifle firing with deadly precision. But he wasn't shooting at the gang either. He was taking out the other posse members, the ones still loyal to Morrison. One by one, they fell. Bill stared in disbelief. The tracker was in on it too. But on whose side? The canyon was a three-way crossfire, a storm of lead and betrayal, and Bill was trapped in the middle with a terrified little girl. His promise to Lucy had led him into the very heart of hell. And the devil wasn't just one man. It was a conspiracy. And it was trying to bury him. The world devolved into a symphony of gunshots, ricochets, and screams. Bullets whined past Bill's head like angry insects. The posse was being torn apart. Two men lay dead, cut down by the unseen sniper. Another clutched his chest, shot by Johnny Two Horses. The tracker moved with a chilling efficiency, his face a mask of grim purpose. He wasn't a traitor. He was an executioner. Bill dragged Amy further behind the rocks, shielding her small body with his own. He had to end this. He risked a look over the boulder. Sheriff Morrison was trying to rally his last remaining loyal deputy, but the man's eyes were wide with terror. Clayton Blackwood and his brother were using the chaos to their advantage, firing at both the posse and the hidden sniper. They were trapped in the middle of a war they didn't understand. Suddenly, Johnny Two Horses was there, appearing beside Bill as if from thin air. "Stay down," the tracker hissed, reloading his rifle with steady hands. "This ain't your fight, Thornton." "The hell it isn't," Bill growled, shoving Amy deeper into the crevice. "Who is the sniper? Who are you working for?" Johnny's dark eyes met his. "Justice," he said, and the single word was filled with a century of grief and rage. Morrison made a deal with a railroad man, a man named Sterling. He wanted Henderson's land for the new spur line. Henderson refused to sell. The pieces slammed together in Bill's mind with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about protection money. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was a land grab, a cold, calculated murder for profit. Sterling hired the Blackwoods to burn Henderson out, make it look like a standard raid, Johnny continued, his voice low and intense. But Jesse Blackwood got drunk and trigger happy. They killed them. Morrison's job was to lead the posse into a trap, get you all killed by a hired gun, and blame the heroic last stand on the Blackwoods. He and Sterling walk away clean with the land in their pocket. "And the Johnson raid, Amy?" Bill asked, his blood boiling. "A diversion," Johnny spat. "Another layer of lies. They were supposed to release her once the posse was dead. A miraculous rescue by Sheriff Morrison." Bill looked at the sheriff, who was now screaming orders that no one was following. He wasn't just a corrupt lawman. He was a monster who would sacrifice children for a payday. "And you? How do you know all this?" A flicker of profound sadness crossed the tracker's face. "Mary Henderson was my cousin. Her mother was Lakota. She told me Sterling was threatening her family. She asked me to watch over them." His hands tightened on his rifle. "I was too late to save her, but I will not be too late to avenge her." That's when Bill finally understood. Johnny wasn't working for anyone. He had manipulated the situation from the start. He'd let Morrison set his trap, knowing he would be there to turn it back on him. The sniper on the ridge wasn't Morrison's man. He was Johnny's. "So this is all you?" Bill whispered, a sense of awe mixing with his horror. "You set this all up?" "Morrison set the board," Johnny corrected him. "I just moved the pieces." In that moment, the fight shifted. Clayton Blackwood, finally realizing he'd been played for a fool by Morrison, let out a roar of fury. "You set me up, you son of a bitch," he screamed, and he and his brother turned their guns on the sheriff. The canyon became a maelstrom. Morrison's last loyal deputy went down under a hail of bullets from the Blackwoods. Morrison himself, wounded and desperate, made a run for it, trying to climb the rocks to escape. But Johnny was faster. He rose from their cover, a specter of vengeance, and fired a single perfect shot. The sheriff tumbled from the rocks and landed in the dust, his reign of terror over. With Morrison dead, the Blackwoods turned their attention to Bill and Johnny. "You're next, lawman," Clayton snarled. But before he could fire, another shot rang out from the ridge. The sniper, Johnny's man. Jesse Blackwood jerked, a hole appearing in his chest, and fell from his saddle. Clayton stared at his dead brother, his face a canvas of shock and disbelief. He looked up at the ridge, then back at Johnny and Bill. He was alone, outgunned and outmaneuvered. He threw his gun into the dust. "I surrender," he choked out. Silence fell over the pass, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and death. It was over. Bill slowly stood up, pulling a terrified Amy from behind the rock. She clung to him, sobbing. Across the canyon floor, Johnny Two Horses walked over to Clayton Blackwood, his face like stone. This wasn't about the law. This was about a blood debt. Bill knew he should intervene, but he couldn't bring himself to move. After everything that had happened, maybe this was the only kind of justice that made sense. But Johnny didn't raise his rifle. He simply stared down at the outlaw. "You burned my family," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You will pay for that, but not here. Not today." He gestured with his rifle. "Get on your horse. Ride. Tell your boss, Sterling, that I am coming for him next. Tell him the debt for Mary Henderson will be paid in full." Blackwood, shaking, scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, not once looking back. Bill walked over to Johnny, carrying Amy, who had cried herself into a silent exhaustion. "You let him go?" Johnny turned, and for the first time, Bill saw the immense weight the tracker was carrying. "He is the message," Johnny said. "The snake is more dangerous than its rattle. Morrison was just the rattle. Sterling is the snake, and I will hunt him to the end of the earth." He looked at the carnage around them. "The official story will be that the posse was ambushed. You and the girl were the only survivors. You fought bravely and brought down both the gang and a corrupt sheriff." He gave Bill a long, hard look. "The town needs a hero, Thornton, not a complicated truth." With that, he whistled, and a moment later the sniper came sliding down the rocks. He was a young Lakota warrior, his eyes burning with the same fire as Johnny's. They took the horses of the fallen men, and without another word, they mounted up and rode away, disappearing into the Badlands like spirits. Bill was left alone in the Valley of the Dead, with a traumatized little girl in his arms and a story too terrible to tell. He looked at the bodies of the men he'd ridden with, men who had died because of greed and lies. He looked at the empty pass where monsters had fought and bled. He had kept his promise. He had saved Amy, but he had failed to save everyone else. He started the long, slow walk back towards Millbrook, carrying the small girl and the heavy burden of the truth. He had survived, but he was now the sole keeper of a secret that could tear the town apart. And he knew with a chilling certainty that this was still just the beginning. The real snake was still out there. Returning to Millbrook was like walking out of a nightmare into a dream. The town was peaceful, the streets quiet. No one knew of the bloody betrayal that had taken place in the canyon. They saw a hero deputy, wounded but alive, carrying a lost little girl home. The story Johnny Two Horses had written for him became the official record. Sheriff Morrison and the posse had died heroically, wiping out the Blackwood gang but falling in the fight. Bill Thornton, the sole survivor, had saved Amy Johnson. They put his name in the paper. They called him a hero, and every word of it felt like a lie. He delivered Amy back to her family, who had rushed to town upon hearing the news. Seeing the girl safe in her grandmother's arms was the only clean, pure thing in the whole damn mess. It was the only part of the story that felt true. But then came the hard part. He went to see Lucy. He found her in Margaret's garden, tending to a small patch of flowers. She looked up as he approached, her old wise eyes searching his. She knew he had answers. He sat with her on the small wooden bench, the scent of lavender and roses hanging in the air. He didn't tell her everything. He couldn't tell a 7-year-old girl about railroad barons and corrupt sheriffs and conspiracies that left a trail of bodies, but he told her the part that mattered. "The men who hurt your parents are gone, Lucy," he said softly. "They won't ever hurt anyone again?" She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Then she asked the question he knew was coming. "But why? Why did they leave the money?" He took a deep breath. "Because they weren't there for the money, sweetheart. They were there for the land. Your papa was a very brave man. He stood up to someone very powerful, and he refused to back down." He chose his next words carefully. "Sometimes bad men don't just want what you have. Sometimes they want to take away what you are. Your papa was a good man who owned his own piece of this world, and they couldn't stand that. The fire, it was to punish him for his courage." It was a simplified truth, but it was a truth nonetheless. Lucy seemed to understand. She reached out and took his hand, the one that wasn't bandaged from a grazing bullet wound. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You kept me safe from the bad men." "I did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I always will." But even as he said it, he knew it was a hollow promise. The real bad man, the snake, was still out there. A man named Sterling, a man so powerful he could order a family massacred and have the law cover it up. How could a simple deputy from a small Montana town ever keep a little girl safe from a man like that? Days turned into weeks. Bill was promoted to sheriff, a title he never wanted. He wore the badge that Morrison had tarnished with his greed, and it felt heavy as lead on his chest. He tried to be the lawman the town believed him to be. He patrolled the streets, kept the peace, and visited Lucy every day. He watched as the light slowly started to return to her eyes. She started to smile again. She even started school where Margaret Whitfield watched over her like a hawk. She was healing, but Bill wasn't. Every night he would sit in his office, staring at the silver button he'd taken from Morrison's pocket after the shootout. It was his only proof, his only link to the real killer. It was a fancy button, with a stylized S engraved in the center. Sterling. He knew he should ride to the territorial capital, show it to the U.S. Marshals, tell them the whole sordid story. But what then? It was his word, the word of a small-town sheriff, against a railroad baron with bottomless pockets and politicians on his payroll. They would bury him. And what would happen to Lucy then? Sterling would find out she was the lone witness, the loose end. He would send someone to silence her. Bill was trapped. To seek justice would be to put Lucy in mortal danger. To keep her safe, he had to let the monster get away with it. One evening, a month after the Canyon shootout, a stranger rode into town. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his face clean-shaven, his hands soft. He didn't look like he belonged in Millbrook. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and walked in. "Sheriff Thornton," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "My name is Arthur Vance. I'm a lawyer. I represent Mr. Sterling of the Union Pacific Railroad." Bill felt a chill go down his spine. He stood up slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "What business does the railroad have in Millbrook?" The lawyer smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "My employer is a man who appreciates civic-minded individuals. He heard about your heroism, Sheriff, about how you single-handedly saved this town from the Blackwood gang." He placed a heavy leather satchel on Bill's desk. "Mr. Sterling believes heroes should be rewarded. He has made a very generous donation to the town of Millbrook, enough to build a new school, and a personal stipend for you, of course, for your troubles." Bill didn't look at the bag. He looked at the lawyer's cufflink. It was an ornate silver circle with a stylized S engraved in the center. It was a perfect match for the button in his pocket. This was it. This was the moment of truth. He could take the money, ensure Lucy's safety through silence, and let the town prosper on blood money. He could accept that this was how the world worked, or he could spit in its face. My town doesn't need a new school that badly, Bill said, his voice deadly quiet, and I'm not for sale. The lawyer's smile faltered. I think you misunderstand, Sheriff. This isn't a bribe. It's a gesture of goodwill. Mr. Sterling is also acquiring the old Henderson property. A tragedy, that fire. But progress must continue. We intend to run a spur line right through there. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Take the money, Sheriff. Be the hero everyone thinks you are. Forget about buttons and land deals and sad little stories. It's better for everyone, especially for the little orphan girl. The threat was unmistakable, veiled, polite, but as clear as a gunshot. We know about her. Keep quiet, or she's next. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Bill. He had spent his whole life serving the law, believing in its power to protect the innocent. But the law was useless here. The law was bought and sold by men like Sterling. There was only one law left that mattered, the law of the promise he made to a terrified little girl in a dark cellar. He slowly pulled open his desk drawer and took out the silver button. He tossed it onto the desk. It spun for a moment before clattering to a stop next to the satchel of money. The lawyer's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. I believe this belongs to your boss, Bill said. He then walked to the door and locked it. He turned around, and the friendly town sheriff was gone. In his place was the man who had survived the canyon, the man who had faced down monsters. You came here to deliver a message, Bill said, walking slowly back towards the desk. Now you're going to take one back to Sterling for me. You're going to tell him that Millbrook isn't for sale, Henderson's land isn't for sale, and Lucy Henderson is not to be touched. The lawyer for the first time looked afraid. And what if he doesn't listen? Oh, he'll listen, Bill said, a grim smile touching his lips. He leaned across the desk until his face was inches from the lawyer's. Because you're also going to tell him about a man I met in the Badlands, a man whose cousin was murdered, a Lakota tracker who doesn't believe in lawyers or money, a man who is hunting him right now. Tell him Johnny Two Horses sends his regards. The lawyer's face went pale as a sheet. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the stories about the ghost of the Badlands, the man who couldn't be caught, the man who delivered his own kind of justice. Bill stood up straight. Now get out of my town, and if I ever see you, or anyone who looks like you, near Lucy Henderson again, I won't kill you. I'll just give Johnny your location. I imagine he'd be very grateful. He unlocked the door and threw it open. The lawyer scrambled out of the office, leaving the satchel of money on the desk. He practically fell onto his horse and galloped out of town as if the devil himself were on his heels. Bill watched him go, his heart pounding. He had just declared war on one of the most powerful men in the West. He had no army, no allies besides a ghost in the wilderness, and no real plan. All he had was a promise. He walked back to his desk and picked up the satchel. It was heavy. He carried it over to Margaret Whitfield's house. He found her and Lucy on the porch, reading a book together in the evening light. He set the bag down. Margaret, I want you to take this, he said. Take it and Lucy and get on the first train east. Go to San Francisco. Go anywhere he can't find you. Don't tell me where. Just go, and don't come back. Margaret stared at him, then at the bag, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. But Lucy, with her child's wisdom, understood. You're sending us away, she said, her voice small. You're not coming with us. I can't, Bill said, his heart breaking. I have to stay here. I have to make sure the bad men can't follow you. He knelt in front of her, just as he had in the cellar. This is the last part of the promise, Lucy. Keeping you safe means sending you away from me. Tears welled in her eyes. But I don't want to go. I know, he said, his own voice cracking, but you have to be brave. He took her small face in his hands. You're a Henderson. You come from brave people, and you will grow up strong and happy, and you will forget all about this. She threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. I'll never forget you, Sheriff Bill, she sobbed into his shoulder. He held her for a long time, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize the feeling of her small arms around him. This was the price of his promise. This was the sacrifice. He had saved her from the fire, only to have to send her into exile. He had kept the bad men away, but in doing so, he had to lose the one person who made his fight worthwhile. The next morning, he stood at the train station and watched as a puff of smoke on the horizon grew larger, became an engine, and then a train. He saw a small hand wave from a window, and he raised his own in reply. He stood there on the platform long after the train had disappeared, leaving only an empty track and a deafening silence behind. He was alone, the hero of Millbrook, the man who had won. But it felt like the most devastating loss of his life. He turned and walked back to his office. The war wasn't over. Sterling would not take this defeat lying down. He would send more men, more dangerous men. And Bill would be waiting. He was the shield, and he would not be broken. If you were moved by Bill Thornton's promise, and you believe that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss our next story.